Space policy is the other thing. Quote, space is a place and not an abstract or single policy issue. Space policy is a misnomer because one policy could not govern an entire environment. So I love that you just put those back to back, and it's like, it's important, but it's not a catch-all. And we need to kind of like, not, I don't know if it's the Hegelian, synthesis kind of deal, but like, how can we kind of think about space policy when there's a multipolar world? We just talked about the space power. We just talked about astropolitics, but then also you mentioned the certain technical kind of affordances or disaffordances that certain technology kind of goes in one direction or the other. And I think you make a really good point in that any space policy that's been happening has to be taken into account with this international system that's based on anarchy. So maybe touch on that a little bit in terms of space policy.
Yeah, so similar to space power, space policy has to be looked at in a similar way that we use our political and policy language. And the thing is, states and countries don't have a sea policy. There's no air policy. So space policy sounds a bit weird, but it's a term that's stuck. And for abbreviating my own statements and comments and bios in many places, I say space policy because it means a certain thing to the community I'm speaking to at the time. So, but the problem is, though, is that because space is a place where you have military activities, industrial, economic, commercial activities, civil infrastructure activities, scientific activities, exploration activities, everyone has their own idea of what they mean by space policy. Because you talk to loads of Americans, they'll think that space policy is just about what NASA's doing and Congress's oversight of NASA. Whereas they never mention anything about the Pentagon or the intelligence community or American space industry or foreign policy and space. So what the US is doing at the United Nations, for example, to do all that in terms of norms and laws, international laws in space. So space policy can mean all of those. And I think only as a top level phrase, it can only make sense because you have to burrow down into the details with space policy, because you have to give it substance. Because I'm not massively interested in the finer points of space industrial strategy and policy. Right. I know it's important, but it's not my expertise. It's military and security policy when it comes to space is what I'm very much interested in. So that's the sort of the space as a place and a policy issue, because you have to be clear in communicating, and the scientists and space science enthusiasts have to accept that space is being used by other communities as well, and have as much of a right to claim space as their thing as you do. In the same way that you can talk about naval power at sea and sea power in that sense, nobody's really talking about marine science.
Right.
Only insofar as mapping, nobody cares about what marine biologists are doing when you're talking about the US Navy squaring off against the PLA Navy in the South China Sea. In the same way, then, that you have people like saying the sky is falling in because China's got a robot on the far side of the moon with a potato on it, worried that this is eroding American dominance in military powers. Like, no.
Well, a lot of recent news, I think it was because I don't know, the NASA administrator within the last week was kind of worried about that and fomenting a little bit about like, oh man, China could eclipse us or whatever, and it's this kind of soft power propaganda in the media.
That's just to basically try and get Congress to give him more money, really, for NASA. It's just part of the discourse and the language, really. And it'll work on some politicians and some media outlets, but yeah. So people need to separate the different areas of activity, because there are areas where countries that are threatening each other militarily on Earth, assuming there's no war actually going to happen, they might still actually be able to coordinate or deconflict scientific activities because they're not that important.
Right.
I know many people will hate me for saying that, but The protection of Taiwan, for example, for the United States is far more important and sensitive than making sure that American and Chinese rovers don't crash into each other on the moon. There's no strategic impact of, you know, not cooperating on the moon or things going wrong on the moon. It's quite harmless, to be honest.
Oh, interesting. So yesterday I talked with Fred Sharman. He was talking about how there's something in the laws of the treaties that basically, like, you have to almost like you are required to give aid in space or something. If you're like, there's some rules of like more collaborative kind of efforts in the laws. So right now I just kind of want to, but as we've kind of grounded our, 3 points before we get into your book, how can we think also about scale in this? Because I know in your introduction, you put to kind of, a couple pages about the different orbits. So I don't know if it's maybe interesting to go into a little bit of what kind of scale we're talking about, because it really is at the level of, say, nation states. And then I think you allude a little bit to possible creations of supranational organizations of sorts. And so maybe we should just talk about that a little bit of, well, what is the dominant kind of, what is the dominant nature, or what is the baseline that we're talking about here in terms of space policy, space law, those kind of things? Because there's no overarching supranational organization or government that's deciding these. It's kind of happening all in as is. Like we're putting the track down before we're, the train is going, I guess you could say.
Well, it's just an extension of the international system. So you mentioned the anarchic order before, and space is just an extension of that, and so is anything that we decide to do collectively as a species politically. So there's potential for supranational organizations to take maybe more responsibility and jurisdiction, but
Okay.
UN law applies in outer space and on other celestial bodies, so moon, asteroids, planets, etc. But those treaties are very, they're quite aspirational, and it's about sort of encouraging states to behave in certain ways. And there's always room for interpretation, especially in international laws as well. So like basically if somebody requests help, if and you're able to help, then you should have a good reason to not do so. To try and not violate the treaty. But then if you are violating the treaty or not, again, it will be a matter of a political and legal debate. If you look at particular parts of the Outer Space Treaty, it talks about refraining from causing environmental damage, things like that, but everybody's polluting Earth orbit. So, Article 9 in the Outer Space Treaty is already being violated, according to some interpretations of Article 9 about the Outer Space Treaty, about modifying certain environments. But what it comes back to is political will to try and enforce rules, really, whatever countries agree to. And you mentioned the big six space powers earlier. So if the United States, the European Union, Russia, China, Japan, and India are able to agree on things in space, then most other countries would have very little option but to fall in line, really, because everyone else wants to cooperate with those countries or buy and sell in their markets as well. So if those six are able to agree on perhaps a new version of the Moon Treaty that will govern how resources can be used by scientific outposts there, and whether they allocate landing sites in a certain way, if those six can agree, they can wrap it up between themselves, and it'll be up to the other countries to try and make sure that they get what they want out of that deal as well. So a lot of the global south would have to think very carefully about what India would be doing in that, because as we've seen in 1976 with the Bogota Declaration, India and China were seen by many as global south states in the 1970s.
Yes.
But equatorial states tried to claim sovereignty into infinity above their territories, so into the geostationary orbital belt, so that countries would stop parking satellites above their territories in geostationary orbit. Everyone ignored them, including India and China, because they didn't want equatorial countries to start taking up prize orbital slots in geostationary orbit. But those countries are also competing to influence those other countries as well. So you'll see in the Artemis Accords that the United States has managed to get more Global South countries to sign up to the Artemis Accords as part of participation in the future lunar program with the United States. So and those are reflections of the anarchic order, because what that really means is beyond the most powerful states in the international system, and what power means is a massive area of debate, but the most powerful states basically have to police the system themselves, because there's nobody above the state to enforce anything that you might call a collective will. So if the United Nations Security Council rules that we need to invade somewhere to prevent genocide or something, it's the UN Security Council's biggest military powers that have to commit the resources to do it, because the United Nations doesn't have an army of its own. It has contributions to its forces from national or state militaries. And space is part of that system. It's not separate from it. And again, another point of frustration I have is many people think that things happen differently in space. It's like, no, all those treaties were products of the power political interests of the time. The Outer Space Treaty allowed the superpowers and the other powers that signed it to carry on doing what they wanted to do in space, which was to build and deploy military satellites and to continue accessing space to deliver their nuclear weapons through it. Because the Outer Space Treaty didn't really ban anything important from a military perspective from being done, or useful from being done, it's been one of the most popular treaties ever in the UN system.